Hello, and welcome to our webinar, Transforming from Traditional Competitor to Ecosystem Powerhouse. I'm Abby Lundberg, Editor-in-Chief of MIT Sloan Management Review, and I'll be your moderator. Today's competitive landscapes are shifting from well-defined industries to broader ecosystems. Traditional boundaries are collapsing, with competitors coming from new directions and pursuing different goals from those of traditional rivals. We see this at work in the transition from automobiles to mobility solutions, from banking to fintech platforms, and from production lines to intelligent factories. Companies need a new approach to strategy for managing in this world of ecosystem disruption. In today's session, Ron Adner, author of Winning the Right Game, How to Disrupt, Defend, and Deliver in a Changing World, will offer advice and a framework for what ecosystem disruption looks like and its implications for leaders. Ron Adner is a Leverone Chaired Professor and Professor of Strategy and Entrepreneurship at the Tuck School of Business at Dartmouth College. His work combines academic research, managerial insights, and practical frameworks that have been applied, tested, and validated in some of the world's leading organizations. This webinar is part of our Management on the Cutting Edge series. MIT Sloan Management Review has joined forces with MIT Press to explore the digital frontiers of management and provide practical advice to business leaders on how to prepare for the exciting and challenging future ahead. Winning the Right Game is part of this series. Welcome, Ron.
Thank you, Abby. It's great to be here with you, and a real pleasure to have the opportunity to share some of these ideas. You know, as you say, the whole notion of where we are as a business community seems to be changing in front of our eyes. I think if we just think about the news from last week with the breakup of some of really the largest, most established companies in multiple economies, it tells a pretty compelling story, right? And it's the story of how is it that really we have to remember these are spectacular companies with spectacular individuals, both at the top and in the middle, getting all this work done. And yet the breakup of GE, Toshiba, J&J is really the stark reminder that the old way of winning no longer seems to be as effective as it used to be. And it's interesting when we read about this, it's like, oh, these are old economy players. It's not that long ago that we saw how technology players go through the same transition, right? IBM, HP, the same kind of breakup. And the discussion tends to be, well, these conglomerates, they're too diversified, there's not enough focus. And then at the same time, if you step back and think about the modern champions, they look pretty diversified, possibly even more diversified than the classic players, right? Think about everything that Amazon is doing, from retail to web services to video streaming. Apple is doing computers and healthcare and financial transactions. The story is not one of just focus. The story is one of a shift in focus. And that's what I want to set of ideas I want to share with you guys around this heading of the title of my new book, Winning the Right Game. And what that title is supposed to evoke for you is the notion that there are multiple games being played simultaneously, and that suddenly the big challenge within strategy is not just figuring out how to win, but how to pick the game you're playing. And I think for established companies, a big part is to figure out, well, how is the game changing so that I can begin to make those choices. And I'll motivate the talk with what I think is a poster child example of where old strategy thinking succeeds and where it begins to fray, right? And so if we think about the car industry, right? Here's a picture of a car for you. Historically, when we thought about how to analyze competition, we'd look at the car industry and we'd think about the companies that make cars. Ford versus GM, industry analysis, barriers to entry, Porter's 5 forces, kind of the classic MBA canon, told us really well, by the way, how to think about profitability, what's going to change profitability, et cetera. Right, then we had a next wave of thinking, which came to us under the heading of disruptive technologies, right? Clay Christensen's really powerful notion of attacks from below, right? A different kind of entrant, which was easy to overlook until they became good enough to be a threat. And we had, throughout the 80s and 90s and into the 2000s, we were thinking about competition in this way. And I would say we're actually pretty well armed when it comes to understanding how to compete in this kind of industry. And then something happened, right? So Tesla comes in. And when Tesla first comes in with their notion of an electric car, it was interesting. The incumbents were not that fazed by it, right? Okay, it's a different kind of car. There's a motor instead of an engine. There's a battery. We know how to do that. At least Nissan puts out the Leaf. Ford puts out the Bolt and the Volt. I'm sorry, GM, right? They know how to compete in that industry until something changed, right? So suddenly this company, Tesla, turns out that they're not just putting batteries in cars, right? But they're also expanding into charging infrastructure. And if you're an incumbent, you're like, wait a second, so I'm supposed to make the cars and give you the fuel? That used to be what, Mobil and Exxon used to take care of. And they're bringing in this software, which is a substitute for dealers in some way. And now they're bringing in energy management within the home. They're adding insurance. And you begin to look at a company like Tesla and you realize that they're playing a somewhat different game. Doesn't mean they're going to win, by the way. It doesn't mean it's the right game, but it's different. And so the way you need to conceptualize the competition begins to feel a little bit different, right? And you look at these other rivals in the space, Uber, right? The taxi company says, not only do we connect you with taxi drivers, but we're going to be taking care of autonomous vehicles. And Apple and Google that sells online ads says we actually have an argument for why we should be in autonomy through Waymo. And suddenly what we're beginning to see is that the very notion of what it is that this industry is trying to do, right, that is to deliver personal mobility, it's becoming harder and harder to recognize. And it's this kind of context where we can no longer talk about competing in the car industry. Rather, we need to talk about the mobility ecosystem. And we see this everywhere. We see this in healthcare as hospitals are moving from delivering services within their walls to thinking about population health. We see this in education. We see this in retail. Really, anywhere you go, you can see this kind of transition. And I'm going to suggest to you that this is the transition that is now what companies are wrestling with. And what we're lacking is the tools for how to do this right. So let me actually, kind of just out of curiosity, where the folks at home are, just to get a sense where people are. Right. So here's a poll. To what extent is your environment characterized by this kind of change? Where is it? How many people think that where they're playing, the classic boundaries are still in place, things are clear and stable, versus at the next level, choice B here is there are rumblings of change, right? Their rivals are largely as before, but we can begin to see some changes on the edges. Choice C is, well, no, we're already in this thing, but we're still managing to change the rules. And finally, choice D is, no, we're living through this full bore. So let's see what. I'll just pause while people enter their answers. I'm very curious to see where we are.
So Ron, we are seeing the answers now. If you can't see them, I'll tell you what they are. We've got
Yes.
two. Can you see them?
No, I can't.
Okay, so we've got 2% clear and stable, 14% rumblings of change, 59% significant changes have started, and 25% full ecosystem disruption.
Okay, so that's not unexpected, but it is kind of it's exciting and challenging at the same time, right? And it's exciting and challenging because what it tells you is things are in flux. There's great opportunities, And at the same time, in most organizations, the way we need to handle these kinds of change is far from clear. And the reason, kind of the argument I'll put forward to you, is that everything that we have within strategy today, which, as we said, was great for a world of industries, is built on the notion of industries. It's built with the expectation that your rivals, maybe they have a different way of organizing things, but they're going after the same prize. Whereas what this notion of an ecosystem disruption is, kind of this modern disruption, which is the heart of this book, it's recognizing that in a world where the game is changing, where the objectives are changing, these tools for assessing competition are really beginning to be overstretched. And the reason is because we're shifting to a world of ecosystems. And ecosystems, I know, is a buzzword that you hear all the time. I do too. I cringe 90% of the time I hear it, because 90% of the time I hear it, it doesn't mean much beyond mishmash. So what I want to do is I want to give you a sense for what I think about when I think about ecosystems, and then how this approach allows us to begin to think about disruption in a new way that is more structured and more actionable. So when I think about what an ecosystem is defined by the structure through which partners interact to deliver a value proposition to the end consumer, right? The key words here are the value proposition, are the notion of structure, and a multiplicity of partners, right? Where you don't have to worry about those things because they're not changing. Our industry tools do a spectacular job of giving guidance. The problem is, right, so essentially when we think about an industry like the car industry, where there's a lot of the traditional car industry, where there's a lot of interdependence, the structure was well established. You didn't have to redefine, well, who's in charge of the intelligence, because we knew the tire gets shipped to the car manufacturer, right? We knew where everybody's position in the value chain was. When we see innovations that begin to change these factors, right? When we see an ecosystem innovation, that's where we need a new set of rules, right? So what distinguishes an ecosystem innovation is that an ecosystem innovation alters the structure, the membership, and the roles in the creation of a new value proposition, right? So even if it's the same actor with new links, right, where suddenly somebody says, no, I'm going to touch the customer, I'm going to take care of this, or the addition of new actors or the repositioning of new actors in pursuit of a new value proposition, that puts us in this world of ecosystem innovation. And it's in this world that the boundaries that we just talked about begin to change. So we have the fortunate 2% that think this is not happening to them. And even there, you'd think, wow, think really carefully about whether it's not happening. But in this world, the challenge of strategy is no longer about can you manage bargaining power, et cetera. The challenge of strategy is how do you deal with this reconfiguration, right? An ecosystem strategy is the way that you approach this alignment or realignment of partners and secure your role in a competitive ecosystem, right? And this is where suddenly it's not just about our own execution. It's not just about our own efficiency, right? We need to start thinking about the way we relate to partners, the way we think about roles. And so out of curiosity, right, this is the only other poll we're going to run today. For the 98% who are in the world of having some kind of boundary shift from that previous poll, how ready is your organization to drive an ecosystem strategy, right? How ready is your strategy, right? So, you know, very ready means we're crystal clear on what we're doing, our people are aligned, and we're ready to dominate, right? Working on it would be, you know, we're still building our strategy, but at least we know our direction. C, lagging behind, you know, this is a cause for concern, right? We know our world is changing, but we're not really aligned on what to do or even the urgency and the direction. And D is, you know, well, we know what's happening, but we're not even started, right? Our leadership itself is not so aligned. And, you know, usually what that means is people in the organization are just watching nervously, hoping for some strategy to emerge. So I can't see the results
Yeah,
of.
so what we're seeing, Ron, is clustering in the middle there. So 42% are working on it, and another 38% feel they're lagging behind. 12% have not even started, and going back up to the top, 9% feel they're very ready.
Perfect. So that's the right distribution, by the way. Right at this point, we're in 2021. Everybody knows this is happening. However, what we also know is that it's a wrestling match to figure out what to do with it. And the really kind of the set of ideas that I want to share with you, and I'll give you a taste in a moment. But the motivation behind this work, right? So this book, Winning the Right Game, essentially it's in 2012, I wrote a book called The Wide Lens, which if you haven't read it, it's a good book too, you should read it. And it was about how do you innovate in a world where your ability to deliver value depends on this reconfiguration of actors. And since then, what I've been confronting is the question of not how do you think about innovation in an ecosystem context, but how do you think about competition? Really kind of the core of strategy. And here, I think really what's required to deal with these kinds of dynamics is a new playbook, right? It's a playbook that lets you need to be able to see change in the environment in a different way around ecosystem disruption and how that's different from traditional technology or industry disruption. You need to think about how you play defense and offense in this kind of world. You need to think about how you time your commitments, because at the same time that you don't want to be too late, there's a big penalty for being too early. And timing in these interdependent contexts itself changes. And then there's really strong implications for how you think about leadership, both leadership as an organizational role, right? We're going to lead our ecosystem, and leadership at the individual level, which is, well, who should be in charge? Who are the people? What are the mindsets required to succeed in this? And so what I want to do now is I want to give you one set of ideas that are covered under this third bullet of ecosystem offense. What does it look like when an actor begins to break the boundaries of industries to create a new ecosystem, right? And the story I want to tell you is a story about Amazon and the Echo and the Alexa voice assistant. And the theme here is that ecosystem offense is really ecosystem construction. And as you construct these ecosystems, what happens is you disrupt the underlying industries. And so the story is going to be about how Amazon came out of nowhere to dominate the smart home ecosystem. And what's interesting is that people have been talking about the smart home really since, as soon as electricity came into the home, people began to imagine ways of making things simpler, right? And then for those of you of a certain age, the Jetsons cartoon on the right, it's kind of funny how much of our current reality they predicted in the 60s. But the smart home story begins as a story of, well, it's three different stories, and we're going to see how they collapse. So what I want to look at is there used to be an industry for smart home hubs, right? This is Apple's HomeKit and Google Home. In the modern version, Microsoft was trying to do this since the 1990s, right? Lowe's had their own version of an attempt. That used to be an industry, and people competed and invested there. A host of different startups got great VC funding. That was one industry. Then there was another industry, and it was an industry for audio speakers, connected speakers, high-end speakers, companies like Bose and Bang & Olufsen, right? That used to be an industry. And then there was a third industry for voice assistants, right? Not voice recognition where you speak and it knew the words that you didn't type, but rather intelligent voice recognition engines that could identify a phrase and then take an action. And into this world, well established, comes in 2014, Amazon. Amazon today obviously is a big technology firm. You got to remember in 2014, Amazon was an e-retailer, right? People didn't think of it as a technology player. Amazon Web Services was barely a public thing. And when Amazon enters this market with the Echo speaker, their history in consumer electronics was really pretty shaky, right? They had, to that point, they launched a very successful e-reader, the Kindle. They had launched a disastrous attempt at smartphones, the Fire phone. It was a huge launch that they then retracted because they got nowhere with it. And then a bunch of Me Too products like the Fire TV stick and the Fire tablet. So not a particularly distinguished actor when they start. And they're coming in, and what they're going to end up doing is collapsing these three industries into one and coming out, I think, in a really surprising, but as we'll see, pursuing a particular framework for ecosystem construction that will be able to understand how they transform both themselves and their context. And just as a placeholder here, keep in mind, the competition here is Amazon against giants, right? Apple is out there with Siri. Google is out there with Google Voice, becomes Google Assistant later in 2012. Microsoft is with Cortana in 2013. And remember, between Apple and Google, that's the entire smartphone market. And between Apple and Microsoft, that's the entire computer market. And here comes Amazon as a late mover. And they come with a product that is regarded as really not a great offer at all. Right, and so here are a couple of different reviews from the time just to anchor us in what the Echo, right, the smart speaker was. So the first statement from the New York Times is, the Alexa intelligence is not intelligent. Alexa is quite stupid. If Alexa were a human assistant, you'd fire her, if not have her committed. Right, compared to what everybody else is offering in this market, Alexa is way behind. Right, The Verge talks about the physical product, the speaker. Do not buy the Echo speaker as a Bluetooth speaker because you can get a much better speaker for the price. And by the way, these guys aren't being mean, they're being objective. Okay, Alexa doesn't know much, and the Echo speaker is a very mediocre, tinny speaker when it comes out. Right, and Consumer Reports has in some ways the most interesting review, which is reminding us that the competition is not some small set of startups. It's Apple, Google, and Microsoft, which are deeply tied as giant ecosystem players, and the Echo knows nothing about Google. This is what the launch looks like. And I think very few people would have predicted that within 6 years, the way this competition would shake out is that Microsoft would completely drop out of the race, Apple would be a distant, practically irrelevant third, Google a distant second, and Amazon dominating the world. Now, we're still in the third or fourth inning. The game is not over, but it's really quite an interesting transition. And the thing I want to note here is, but how did they get there? Right? And remember, our theme is about ecosystems. How do you look beyond a product? How do you look beyond an industry to think about the reconfiguration of this structure to pursue a new structure? And the secret to constructing ecosystems is that the way you do it is not alone and not all at once, right? That you may have this great vision of what you want to accomplish, but because you're depending on other partners moving into new positions, the reality of it is that you construct an ecosystem sequentially. You need to recognize where your starting point is. And by the way, that starting point will depend on the firm. And then you need to think about, well, not just who are the partners I want, but how do I get those partners onto the board? How do I decide that C is the third partner and D is the fourth partner? And this is a new kind of logic, right? And this is a logic that takes us way beyond the notion of, competition or complementers or platforms, because what it's going to focus us on is not the endpoint of lots of interactions, but the way in which we build a strategy to add actors one after the other in order to get to that full system. And so what that means is that in the beginning, necessarily what you're putting out is an impoverished offer, right? So the Alexa, when it came out, Amazon knew what it was. It knew that it was a tinny speaker. It knew that the Alexa was not as intelligent. And knowing that was the starting point to building a strategy for, well, how do we move forward from there, right? And the story here is one of starting with what I call a minimum viable ecosystem. You're starting collaboration and then adding these actors. The point of this, however, is, and this is critical for strategy and organizations, is that as you're building towards your complete ecosystems, towards your full value proposition, you shouldn't allow yourself to be surprised that in the beginning, it doesn't look that great. In the beginning, your challenge is, how do I bring partners and enrich the offer? It's only at the end that you start expecting to see the big material rewards within the consumer market. And that is a challenge. That's a challenge in large companies. By the way, it's also a challenge for investors in smaller companies, because what it means is that the path to revenues is non-linear. In the beginning, the way you need to score your wins is, am I aligning the actors that I need? Not what's the multiple of my revenues and what can I project forward? And so what that means is, in playing an ecosystem game, linear metrics lead to underinvestment, and that's what leads to failure. What does that mean? What does this look like? Let me retell the Amazon story using this framework. Okay, and the secret sauce that incumbents have, by the way, is that when they launch their initial position in the ecosystem, their minimum viable ecosystem, if they've succeeded somewhere else, they can carry over some relationships from that market to start their position in the new market, right? This notion of, and this is why, by the way, winning in ecosystems, incumbents are vastly advantaged over startups if incumbents are ready to deploy and leverage what they've done elsewhere at scale, which requires a level of commitment, which requires a real strategy, rather than being stuck with small pilots and experiments. So let me retell you the Amazon story from this perspective. So Amazon launches the Echo speaker, and inside it is the Alexa voice assistant. And in the beginning, it does very little, right? There's some basic voice controls. But what it does, what differentiates it, is that into the speaker, Amazon has incorporated Prime Music, right? So the Echo is only offered to Prime users. It's not made available to the full market. It's only made available to Prime users, and part of what those Prime users get is to port over the second-rate music streaming service that Amazon had negotiated for 6 months before the release of the Echo, so that you have a tinny speaker in Prime Music, as opposed to like Apple Music or Spotify. You don't get all the latest hits, but you get like the second-tier songs. And the Echo comes out, and it's basically like, a radio you don't need to touch that can sit on your kitchen counter. That's their starting point. And it's critiqued by whoever, as we saw in the New York Times. But the point was not to win with that. The point was to put it out there in order to attract the next set of actors. After Amazon has this out for a couple of months, they launch a new set of skills for the Alexa. And these skills that they add, like Magic 8 Ball, et cetera, they're not materially changing the value of the Echo to the users, but they do demonstrate to a different community, the developer community, that this is a platform that one can and maybe should develop new apps for. And it's only after they offer the Skills 2.0 that they allow external developers to begin to develop things for the Echo. And this is the beginning of a transition, right? So here, this is 1.5 years in, and clearly part of what's happening is, because the Echo and the Alexa are on so many kitchen counters, they are getting more usage. Usage gets you data, and so the intelligence of Alexa is getting better and better, the way we know in a cloud-based world, which also makes it more worthwhile for these external developers to begin to invest in creating skills for this platform. And then it's only after we have enough of these external skills developed that Amazon takes the next step, which is to create APIs that allow the Echo with Alexa inside it to interact with other people's hardware, right? All the people who for 20 years have been trying to do smart home hardware are now invited to, if they want to, allow their products to interact with Alexa because, hey, why not? It's here. And it's only after they launch these APIs that they then take their final step, which is they take the Alexa intelligence out of the Echo speaker and they start selling these chipsets so that you can put Alexa inside whatever your hardware is, right? So whereas it works with Alexa, you would talk to the speaker tower to turn on your lights, now Philips can put the Alexa intelligence in a light switch and you can talk directly to it. And it's in this way that Amazon is able to extend and expand this whole new operating system of what they're calling ambient computing, right? Allowing for voice interactions to guide intelligence throughout not just the home, but now expanding beyond it. And what I want you to see here is this journey and the steps along the journey. And think about if Amazon had started by trying to get all these partners on board on day one, they had gone to Samsung and said, hey, we know that you want to be in charge of the smart home. Why don't you give up that dream and let us be the brains and you just make the hardware alongside LG and GE? The answer would have been forget it. But because of the way in which they built their value proposition, in which they added these partners, they're able to end up in this position. And this is when I say that ecosystem strategy is alignment strategy, this is the core of it. Now, you can always step back and say, oh, yes, but was this really a planned journey? Right? And in that regard, you know, it's funny, like we always step back and you look at a guy like Jeff Bezos and you say, what an amazing visionary he must have been to be able to imagine the idea of a voice assistant, not just a voice assistant in a single location, but throughout a structure, being able to walk around and have a computer intelligence tell different devices what to do. And the pictures I'm showing you obviously are pictures from starting with a TV series called Star Trek, then a bunch of bad movies they made on Star Trek and some extensions that they made to Star Trek. Bezos himself is really clear. The whole idea behind Alexa, the vision for it, was established for him in science fiction. Every single thing the Alexa is doing is predicted as the use case has been shown by Hollywood. And this is the mistake that a lot of people make, is they think that the issue is the vision. And actually, it's interesting. Amazon starts patenting in this Alexa space as early as 2006. The point of understanding success in ecosystems is not, can you come up with that end vision? It's, can you come up with a strategy for how to build, how to put together all the pieces required to deliver that new value proposition and do it in a way that allows you to secure an attractive role in that effort, right? And that's this notion of what ecosystem strategy requires, right? And this is different from the way we usually talk about strategy, right? I say this is a strategy professor. And so the kind of the new playbook that's required, which first of all doesn't require throwing out the old playbook, right? The industry stories, the classic disruption stories, they're still really relevant, but there are places where they are far less applicable, right? And so, you know, my version of what this new ecosystem playbook should look like starts with understanding how industry boundaries collapse, right? And that's kind of this, I'll walk you through the playbook, which is also the order of this book, which is we need to start by understanding how ecosystem disruption upends industry structure. And by the way, there's the first chapter of the book is on my website, ronadner.com. You guys are welcome to read it there. I think it's kind of a really interesting reinterpretation of what disruption really looks like and how we've misunderstood some classic cases in strategy. And each one of the concepts that I lay out here has a framework, right? So it's not just stories. It's, you know, the same way I just told you the Amazon story. There's a process, a logical process that you can follow for thinking about how to understand disruption, how to understand defense. Like, how do you, you know, if you're Spotify, how do you deal with a giant like Apple coming in to disrupt your ecosystem, not as a regular industry rival, but bringing their full ecosystem behind them? You know, Wayfair versus Amazon. Again, there's a different approach that we need to take to thinking about how do we defend against attacks. And in the same way, is a different approach that we need to take for how we want to construct new value propositions in this ecosystem settings, right? So that was the Alexa story I just told you. By the way, in chapter 3, there's a great story about Assa Abloy, a 100-year-old manufacturer of locks and keys that becomes a guardian of digital identity, right? Just to make sure we all understand, this is not just a Silicon Valley type game, right? This applies across the board, right? There are issues to think about in terms of timing, how do we think about competition, not between technologies, but between ecosystems, and telling us when disruption will happen. Ideas around leadership. How do you think about not just how to lead in an ecosystem, but how do you think about profiting potentially as a really smart follower in these ecosystems? Actually, Sloan Management Review just published an excerpt from chapter 5 in the November issue on that, for those who are interested. And then finally, how do you turn strategy into action within an organization? That has to do with using these concepts and constructs as a shared language within the organization. And so I think that's what's required for a playbook. That's what winning the right game is, a 10-year effort to create for myself, that now I'm thrilled to share with you guys. And that's what I wanted to share with you in this webinar, is this notion of, as we're thinking about the transition from industries to ecosystems, really it's about, we need to think about not just coordination and bargaining, it's about how do we rethink alignment? How do we think about establishing roles? And as we think about competition here, the big difference between the GEs of the world and the J&Js, they were diversified firms, right? Every time they entered a new industry, they added competition into that industry. What we saw with Amazon was not an addition of competition, but a changing of what the basis of competition is with Alexa. And that's what ecosystem strategy is really about. Again, it lives side by side with industries, but if you're in one of these industries where this is happening, and I think that's just about every industry, you have to have this additional playbook in order to be able to navigate not just the external environment, but also to give clarity in the internal environment for how you're going to be able to act and allocate resources appropriately. So I'll stop with that, and I'm really curious about reactions, questions. Can't wait to get into the conversation. So thank you.
Super, thank you, Ron. And I hope we do get to come back to the questions to discuss with your team, if you still have that slide. But let's take some questions from the audience right now. We've got some great questions coming in. I really like the minimum viable ecosystem idea. It's kind of like sort of knowing where your weaknesses are and filling those gaps. So Martin asks, wouldn't it be better to have some actors on board before launching, instead of launching a product that isn't good? This would affect the positioning of the brand or product.
So it's a great question, and I think the thing that makes strategy and ecosystems challenging is that it is much more firm specific than a strategy in an industry. So picking your MVE is a firm specific choice, depending on the relationships that you have, the assets that you have. That's going to tell you what the right starting point is. The trap that many companies fall into is feeling that if they put out something into the market that is inferior, their brand will be hit, per Martin's questions, etc. There's an important distinction, by the way, between a minimum viable product, right, the MVP approach, which is now kind of dominating the whole lean startup movement, and an MVE. An MVP is what you do when you're experimenting, trying to figure out what the right value proposition to pursue is. An MVE is after you know what you want to go to, it's your starting point for how to build towards it. And in a world where you can do things yourself and don't need partners, you don't have to worry about this path to construction. But where partners are important for building the value proposition, that's where, by definition, if you can't get everybody into the room all at once, which you never can, then you're going to start with an offer that is less than your dream. And it actually requires a lot of managerial discipline to embrace that and know that you're building towards this better thing, rather than be held back by this fear of, oh, what's going to happen if we get a review like the New York Times gave Amazon. Right? That's why all of this makes sense, but none of this is obvious.
Right.
In real time.
Ron, can you, this is a question from Eddie. Eddie Dunn, can you speak to a values outcome-based approach in the collaboration needed to create the right synergies? There's significant complexity with volume partners. Creating these intimate collaborations is critical. A value-based approach is part of their Eddie's company's winning strategy.
Yeah, so I'm not 100% sure what you mean by a value-based approach, but if you're thinking about, like, the value stick idea of how do you maximize willingness to pay, um, the the essentially what's required to succeed here is understanding, one, the endpoint of value creation for the end customer, right? But two, what are the differences in the way in which your partners are going to be thinking about value creation for themselves? And it's those differences that drive that staged expansion. That's why you can get partner B in place second rather than third. And the point of partner B is the value they add is not just better for the end consumer, it's because you have partner B in place that it's easier to add partner C, right? You can't get C, it's harder to get C without B in this logical sequence. So we're thinking about value-based, but we're aligning partners as high a priority as satisfying end consumers.
Interesting.
That's what it means to think in ecosystems rather than just creating value in industries.
Right. I think this is a somewhat related question from Atif. When building ecosystems based on not alone and not all at once, how can one ensure the components of ecosystems, so ecosystems with 2 to 3 or more actors, that the components are financially viable before moving to the larger ecosystem with 4 or 5 actors or more, or do they even need to be?
Well, so this is one of the decisions that you need to make, right? And this is where, in that animation, I showed you a link that then disappeared. The point of this ecosystem strategy is get to an alignment structure. There can be pieces that come and go. There can be pieces that you create substitutes for over time. But in order to do that, you need to have, one, the plan in your head, but two, if you're in a real organization, what you realize is, and this is this point about language that I make in the chapter 7, it doesn't matter if it's in your head and no one else in your organization understands it, right? The key is, how do you get enough clarity, not just in your understanding of a strategy, but in your articulation of a strategy, that people can have the comfort and the confidence required to make these commitments, right? And I think that's kind of the point of that Bezos Star Trek slide is, what makes him special is not that he had that vision. Everybody has that vision. It's the ability to commit the company to a pathway that lets you grow, recognizing that it's not going to happen all at once.
Yeah, so that raises an interesting question, which Terry asks, which is ecosystem thinking in executive domain only? Can bottom-up ecosystem thinking be successful?
Such a good question. So, and you know the answer, but there's a nuance to it. So, yes, it's important that executives think this way. Then there's a question, well, can you inject it from the middle up? And I think there's a certain amount that you can do that with. And look, that's why I wrote this book, right? You should get this book, you should read it, and then you should give it to the people on top, because they're struggling to come up with this kind of language. So there's this kind of the hopeful version of, yes, can we inject this thinking? And I think the answer is yes. And I do work with companies on exactly this. But the second part of the answer is, if you're in the middle of the organization, you have control both over what you might do with your teams, but just as importantly, what it is that you're going to commit yourself to, right? And a big part of what I think about in the book is, so what are the requirements for success and flexibility, et cetera? And if you're in an organization where things are not set up for it, what happens when companies pursue visionary initiatives is that they start these pilots, and many pilots succeed, and then they go nowhere, right? They go nowhere, not because it was a bad idea, but because the organization couldn't align itself. This is really kind of the chapter 6 discussion. And so the litmus test, if you're in the middle of the organization, is, okay, if I recognize that my organization is not going to be capable of committing to this, how do I want to manage myself and my commitments, right? Because the one thing that you get in the middle of organization is 10 things to do when you have time for 5. So your personal strategy can also be informed by this, right? When I look at the shiny new project, if the organization can't scale it, I want to know that in advance. It doesn't mean I don't want to do it, but it tells me I can set the right set of expectations. And potentially when I negotiate for starting the project, I want to say, here's the exceptional way in which I want this project supported. So it doesn't end up in this graveyard of successful pilots, but rather has a chance at scale.
So just sort of adding on to some of the things you just said, Gautam asks, what are some of the major mistakes that most companies make that can or should be avoided in the journey toward ecosystem play? And talk about that. I think he must have read your book, in both defense and offense moves.
So yes, so that's the book, but a couple of different pieces of it. So so writing this book for me was a process of discovery, right? So this, again, this was a 10-year journey from when I wrote Wide Lens to now. The big discoveries for me were, so what does this mean inside of organizations, and what does this mean in a competitive landscape, rather than just as you're trying to focus on building new value? And so chapter 1 starts with the most overtold, and I will argue most misunderstood story in modern strategy, which is the failure of Kodak. And everyone's heard the Kodak story. They invent digital, and then they can't get out of their own way, and they die as an analog failure in a digital world. And that turns out to be 100% wrong, as you'll get in the first 3 pages of this excerpt you can read. Kodak becomes this incredible contender in digital printing. They do all the impossible things. The thing that kills them is that people stop printing photos, right? It's the screen on the iPhone and Instagram that changes it. And the trap that they fall into, which is endemic within the way we think about strategy traditionally, right? I say this as a strategy professor. The trap is that they think about the way they create their value from a technology and activity perspective. And so the very first thing that we need to do is revisit kind of this level of analysis that I introduced in chapter 1, which is the notion of value architecture. How do you think about what differentiation means? And with this lens, you can begin to see the impact of threats that come not from below in the Christensen sense, not direct substitutes, but the kind of threats that come in from the side, which is what ecosystem disruption looks like, right? It's not that, mini mills are doing steel in a better way, right? Nucor is still selling steel by the ton. What you're concerned about is when people are coming in and the way they're trying to win is different. So you need to start with that. And then from there, what you can start thinking about is, okay, what is it that I need to respond to? And in that response, this is actually the point of this SMR article and chapter 5. As you're thinking about what the future looks like, one of the biggest traps that companies have is they fall into what I call the ecosystem trap. They think that they will be central in whatever it is that's happening. And in doing so, they fail to think about an alternative possibility, which is often far safer and far more profitable, which is how do I participate in an ecosystem change without needing to drive it, right? The appeal of driving it is you get to be the leader, you get to make the most money. That's true if you're a successful leader. Many, many firms try to lead ecosystems and are unsuccessful in it, and they're the ones who lose the most money. And so, again, in an industry context, you don't have this discussion because you always want to lead. And if you fall short, that's okay. You're still better off for the effort. In an ecosystem, if the ecosystem doesn't come together, you get nothing. And so part of what you want to think about internally, and this has to do both with offense and defense to the question, is not just what's the vision, but what's my role in this vision, right? Am I the one who wants to drive the aligning? Am I the one who wants to be aligned? Am I the one who wants to enable and help pick the leader so that as they're doing the aligning, I'm kind of in a favored follower state? That's chapter 5 discussion.
And I would assume that a lot of that upfront work, that strategy building, will play into Frank's question, which is how do you sell the long-term dream to investors most effectively when the path is one based upon many ecosystem partners?
So I think that's a really interesting question. And I think, one, it's surprising, I mean, particularly in today's environment, how much investors are willing to take on faith. So I'll put that as the usual thing aside. The case of Assa Abloy, by the way, that is in chapter 3, in chapter 3, this 100-year-old lock manufacturer, I put it in there explicitly because, so they are a Scandinavian player that's first owned by private equity and then by public market. So they're subject to all the discipline that large incumbents are usually afraid of. What I will say is that the thing you usually hear about in large companies today is, oh, you look at these venture funded companies and how much money they're able to spend without any accountability. And then you look at the actual expenditure within these large companies and you see how big those budgets are. The issue in the large companies is not that there isn't enough money to invest. It's the way in which those investments are being made. And the way they tend to be made is they're spread out over a lot of bets. And then this is that non-linearity that I talked about when I was showing the MBE framework. When those bets don't pay off as quickly as naive expectations led us to believe, which smarter, more informed expectations would have prepared us for, we then reallocate money to other things. And so you spread out this vast expenditure like peanut butter, and you essentially starve everything. So the story for investors is this doesn't require more spend necessarily. It requires more commitment. And more commitment requires more clarity to be willing to take the bet, to realize, to really understand what the risk is. And that again takes us right back to that's why you need a better approach to building strategy so you can have better confidence in that strategy.
So there's two questions here that sort of play off each other. Ricardo asks, what you are saying is that only a very strong incumbent has all the assets and relationships to develop gradually an ecosystem. And is that correct? That it's not a game for startups. But then James says, as a startup, it seems we need to launch an MVE just to prove feasibility to future partners. Are we looking at this in the right way?
So no and yes. So what I'm not saying is that this is only a game for incumbents, right? I was actually putting that against what I think is the dominant logic, that this is a game for, for tech startups. What I was saying is that incumbents are advantaged if they're able to take advantage of their existing relationships and have the confidence to commit to use that to jumpstart an MBE, right? Often they don't have that confidence, which is why they're stuck with these multiple pilots. At the same time, right, so it's not a game just for startups, and it's also just for incumbents. It's also not a game just for startups. What I will say is for startups, it's even more important to get this right because incumbents get to benefit from this continued revenue stream in their core. Startups have, a certain number of pivots in their budget before they run out. And so I think it's critical to think through what alignment looks like as a startup and to be realistic about it. It's interesting. So this ecosystem construction diagram, like that reverse waterfall that I showed you guys, I think this is what every ecosystem ends up looking like. That doesn't mean everybody starts with that in mind, right? So Spotify is an interesting instance of this. So Spotify, which I look at in the ecosystem defense chapter about how they, once they're established, how they very cleverly defend against the full bore attack from Apple. But where they started was 2 years of trying to launch Spotify globally. And it was only after they realized that actually they have to start with an MVE, which is we're only going to be able to convince our music company partners to give us a license for Sweden, because Sweden was the country that was the most pirated music country in the world, which made it an easier place to get the music companies to allow this experiment with rights management. It's only then that they started, and from there they moved to a couple of parts of Europe, and eventually they get to the US and globally. So this is a game that is played by both startups and incumbents. As I said, your ecosystem strategy depends not just on what your goal is, but what it is that you can bring together and assemble. But the efficiency with which you approach it is going to make a huge difference, whether it's for your external investors, for your internal organization and internal commitment, et cetera.
I think we have time for one more question, maybe two, if they're short. So Nikhil says that in MVP, the target customer most of the time remains the same. In MVE, it is continuously changing. I don't know if you agree with that assumption, but, and then the question that I'm interested in is, he asks, also each firm in the ecosystem is having their ecosystem strategy, which might create conflict in the ecosystem. And that you had talked about that alignment, but so how, can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so so chapter 6 is exactly about this. And so it's important. So the point is exactly right, that every firm is in this ecosystem playing to win for themselves. And so the firm that's going to succeed in alignment is not the firm that says, I want to be in charge. It's the firm that gets other people to say, I guess I'm okay if they're in charge. I'm better off that way. That's chapter 5. In order to get to that, you need a leadership mindset, which is an alignment mindset. And that's the whole point of chapter 6, where there's this really interesting contrast about what is it that allowed Nadella to turn Microsoft around compared to Ballmer. And what's interesting is all the technologies that Microsoft is profiting from today were in place and invested in under Ballmer. The thing that Nadella is a master of is creating a context where other firms can see themselves as being successful. So every chapter has a starting quote. The starting quote for chapter 6 is that every person is necessarily the hero of their own journey. And then in some chapters, like an Adner corollary to this quote. And here the corollary is the ecosystem leader's job is to find a way of preserving that. There's a better quote. The quote is pithier than that. But basically, it's the leader is the one who gives other people the opportunity to remain the heroes of their own story, right? That's what it means to accept the fact that different parties in your ecosystem do have their own ecosystem strategies. And that requires this alignment mindset, which requires an understanding of both these strategy principles, but also a different kind of empathy than we're used to emphasizing within organizations.
So I know we really don't have time for one more question, but I want to get this one in because it follows on what you were just talking about. And the question is from Ian: how do you think about resilience within an ecosystem, i.e. securing and defending your role within an ecosystem when collaborators could also assume a competitor role, similar to Samsung and the Samsung and Amazon example?
Oh my God, that is such a great question. Read chapter 1. So one of the new phenomena that we see here that actually we don't have within the language of economics is the transition from complementer to substitute. That this is actually something you need to have top of mind as you're thinking about building this ecosystem, because to this point, the relative positions of firms can change over time, and this is a dynamic game. And so this needs to be built there. This needs to be built into your strategy. But again, the body of frameworks that I have here embraces that rather than pretends to be surprised by that dynamic, right? And in some ways, that's the key to successful strategy. It's rather than hoping that things will work out, it's embracing the challenges that are there and then building a strategy that is robust to those challenges from the outset.
Fantastic, Ron. So many great insights and so many great questions from the audience. You'll get a chance to see the rest. I'm sorry we didn't have time to get to all of them, but we are out of time. So thank you, Ron, for this, and thank you all so much.
Thank you, everybody. It was really great.